Hey, here we are. Happy Tuesday, Dr. Deanne. How are you?
Doing pretty good. Still recovering from last week, but I'm
Mm,
feeling better. Got my head here.
Good, good. It's the season.
And you?
Things are starting to pick up in terms of illness and the cooties going around, but you know what? We're going to keep fighting. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. If you're on YouTube or LinkedIn or directly in Restream, we want to give you a shout out. Would love to have you share your name, where you're from, and we want to hear your questions throughout the conversation. So feel free to pepper them in. And when we take a pause, we will address your questions or comments. So today we are going to talk about user expectations and how they are changing. So, first off, I think this is a twofold conversation because we're talking about user expectations changing, but I feel like you cannot talk about that without also talking about how the role of UX research or the skills that UX researchers and designers they also have to change.
Yeah.
So it's kind of twofold.
Yes, and I think we've had a recent experience with that, seeing how those expectations have shifted and how we need to start looking at projects and engaging with users, that sort of thing based on those expectations. Because, like you said, and we're going to dive into it, expert, novice to expert. So
Yes,
even if
yeah.
they're not an expert, they're an expert and they have expectations of being an expert without having to have expert savvy knowledge in terms of technology. So it is really
Exactly.
interesting.
Exactly. I'm glad you brought that up. So when we think about the evolution of technology use, especially computers were reserved when they first kind of came out and were available to the public. They were only utilized by experts in computer science or in computing. And then it moved to novices having access to computers, which meant that we had computers in our households and we were all ramping up in learning. And now things have shifted, the tides have turned, and now everyone's a quote unquote expert. And when we talk about experts, like you said, that doesn't mean that they're always technically proficient and understand things from a technical or coding perspective, but expectations have changed.
Yes, and their tolerance for that learning curve has changed as well. So,
Exactly.
yeah,
And as we look at customers don't always know about what's technically feasible, they expect tech to support their workflows,
yeah,
which means they expect that technology can do things today that it may not have done or they didn't necessarily know it could do those things in
right.
the past. They expect it. They don't always know how to articulate it. So you can't say what do you want or what do you need to a customer. You have to be able to step away from that and understand where that requires you to understand their workflow.
Yeah,
So you first have to understand their workflow. And then once you gain that understanding of their workflow, you have to listen out for those points of friction, points of confusion, heavy lifting that they're doing in those different stages to then figure out where can I insert technology or a system to help improve their workflow.
right. Or integrate, but I know we'll discuss that one next. So yeah, it's kind of that build it or integrate with it or partner with someone to accomplish that. But I like the discussion with the workflows. You've got to step back and look at those workflows. You have to step back and look at those workflows from maybe a more tech savvy user versus your
Mhm.
non-techie user who has the same expectations in terms of what they want to accomplish, but
Mhm.
very different in terms of how they might want to or expect to get there. So, yeah, and that's really taking that step back. And when you're doing those workflow analyses, you're looking at all those tools, you're looking at that user base, you're looking at their expectations. Heck, they'll tell you what those expectations are a lot. Anyhow, yeah, you're
You
absolutely
know, so when I think about this statement, the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that when we talk about incorporating or inserting technology into someone's workflow, the key word that you said is expectations.
Mhm.
Expectations are not always a definition of what that solution is.
Yeah.
And so, what we have in a lot of cases are technologists driving the bus,
Yes.
and therefore they naturally understand technology like, a second language. And so that then becomes, let's insert this technical capability or feature that requires heavy
Yeah.
customization, and that sort of thing. And that's not what customers are looking for. They're looking for configuration that a layman can understand and work with, but they expect that power or that capability on the back end to take place or occur. And so you have to have that balance between what you serve up in the interface and how people can kind of move those levers versus what you do in terms of complexity and technical definition and the way things interact on the back end. People don't want to necessarily understand all of that detail.
Exactly, and that is what sometimes ends up happening. So you do have technical people with amazing capabilities and
Mm-hmm.
products with amazing features that tend to be surfaced. That back end tends to be surfaced to the user where they don't need to see how the sausage is made. They just
Mm-hmm.
want in the end to have that piece of sausage. When they're
Mm-hmm.
interacting with the product. So I think that's a lot of projects you go into, and I can name many projects that I've worked on and products I've worked on, and you go in there and you see all the power, you see all the
Mm-hmm.
the innovation there, but you actually really see it too because
You
it's
see
kind
too
of
much of it.
you see too much of it and it becomes
Mm-hmm.
part of your workflow dealing at the front end with the surfacing of just way too much touching on the user's end. And I would say, Kenya, that even if you've done that in the best and easiest way possible,
Mm-hmm.
surfacing it, that's where when you're really, really looking at user expectations and high level concepts, what like we'll throw really high level wireframes, for instance, up there to get an idea how the user would respond to it, but that's got to be complete enough to understand all the components or thoughts or things
Mm-hmm.
they touch that would in a real situation go into it. But that's a lot of times you can do something as simple as throwing up those high level wireframes after your discovery work, getting with the user, walking
Mm-hmm.
through it, and really getting an idea of where they would expect to touch or have to your point, configure something or
Mm-hmm.
go into advanced um, functionality, whatever that may be, versus, hey, that's great, it does this, but that's just getting too complicated. I'm not going to do it. And I had interviews just in the past few weeks where people you never expect to mention, hey, that's great, and I love the power of these settings or these configurations and what it can do for me, but why do I have to do it? Why can't you figure that piece of it
Exactly.
out for me? And it really that came through in simple, like, in-depth interviews. In fact, in that
Mm-hmm.
case, don't even need the wireframes yet because now that's going to feed
Mm-hmm.
into everything we better not, if technically possible, having those wireframes. So, yeah, definitely they know what's feasible, but it's going to impact their impression and even adoption of the product if they feel like they can't, it's not simple enough. And we've gotten to be very, very, very uh, I know I expect simplicity. I don't care if I'm running a
Absolutely.
design session. I want to think about how to pull up that whiteboard and us all to, work on it. It should be that kind of a
Absolutely.
feel. And yeah.
Uh, as you were just saying that, what it reminds me of is like a light switch. And so if
Mhm.
my intent is to turn the light on or off, I expect to flip the switch, but I don't expect that I have to get or access to the wiring behind the switch to make sure that the connections are made and to pull those connections apart to turn the light off. Like that's the stuff that happens on the back end. What I see on the front is the control that allows me to adjust either lights on, lights off, or that gradient of lighting. And so when we look at physical objects, in a lot of cases, we haven't done a good job of transferring that same sort of mental model in the way in which we do things in the digital realm. And with that example, I can access those wires if I need to, if I'm an expert or an electrician or have some proficiency around that, I can gain access to those things. But it's the same analogy when you think about black boxing your technology. If it's black boxed, then the person doesn't have anything to give them context around what's happening on that back end. But if you give them too much on the other end of the spectrum, then it's almost overwhelming around what can I actually mess with? What am I going to break? You know, what if I make this new connection? Is it actually going to work? So you have to find that balance in between. And to your point, when you think about going through the exercise of showing someone really high level wireframes, those high level wireframes then allow for that person to talk through their understanding, their perceptions, their expectations that might differ from what you thought they were. And like you said, with those interviews that you're conducting, just because it's possible or technically feasible doesn't mean that you should implement it, but it also means that doesn't mean that the user should have control over it. You might want to put that on the back end, but you've got to do the work to know what the balance is between what you surface in the interface and what you put behind the scenes.
And include both groups. So back to your back to your light switch. So I want the home consumer that just needs to turn their light on, but I also might want to talk to, I know this is kind of going back. This is all resolved for 100 years, but there's some people, I need to talk to those electricians who need to get behind that panel.
That's right. And so, what do they need or expect?
Yes, because you do have different needs, but I would still argue that even the techies are getting where they don't want you to surface all the tech.
Correct. It's noise.
Yes. And if you look at those workflows, they'll kind of tell you where they need it surfaced, the ones who may be more advanced. But so it's just, I think it's always a good idea to say, what are the other systems you're using? What are, how are you going to interact with this? Let's go to a form builder. Oh, yep, there you go.
Perfect segue. Perfect segue. So when you think about it's a really, really complicated but delicate balance of, first of all, user expectations around tech has grown and they expect power, they expect robustness, but not the complexity that us technologists might understand. Yeah. But then second to that, you then want to look at where can you couple that technology or that capability, because it's really about the capability. How do you look at using systems that they already have in place?
Well, yeah. Well, to me, that's a reasonably easy thing to accomplish if you're just talking to your users. If you're doing those, whether it be take me homes or IDIs or just breaking down that workflow that also considers a task analysis that has to look at existing processes or tools. That is part of your workflow. If you're doing an end to end. One of the best examples I know is I worked on a product. We're trying to build out forms, and we gave all this control to build out these documents, just from scratch. Well, it turned out a lot of people just wanted us to hand them over some templates and let them tweak it from there.
That's right.
But then you had the people and then integrate with existing systems and let them handle, for instance,
that's right,
the reporting or the document repository. We don't add steps in there because now you're trying to be my document management solution for my forms. I just need you to build out these forms, for me.
That's right.
Forms. if they're already using OneDrive, let's just integrate. Don't add more complexity to now force them. In this case, they were pretty much forced to take everything out of the system, set up, a reminder once a week, check all those forms out, and then go over here and upload them to OneDrive. So that's not a question of a techie versus a non-techie, but it does go back to this seamlessness that people expect in you to be able to play nice with things they already use.
But even if we look at CRM systems and how they've evolved, and you used to work in your CRM, then you go over to your email. Now you have that tight integration where you can serve up CRM data in your email or push the information or updates that are made through email into your CRM. That's a really good example. I recall working with a client who was looking at understanding why their users were not, and these were employees and customers, were not using a system that they put in place to help them make more effective decisions during different parts of their job. And they couldn't understand why we're delivering this value, but they're not using it. And what they discovered was it wasn't about the tool. It was about the fact that the value or the insight coming out of that tool was better suited in the system that they lived in all day. So give me a way through an API, an integration point other than an API, give me a way to see that value in my system that I'm in 10 hours, 15 hours out of the week versus me having to go from system to system. And, even if it's single sign-on, single sign-on is not always the answer.
Yeah,
it's about...
That just gets me in there.
Yeah, that just gets me in there. But that doesn't allow me to get the right information at the right time to make the right decision, because that's ultimately, again, going back to workflow. You understand your user's workflow. There's so much in the way of really understanding your requirements, essentially.
Yes. And back to the expectations, even when we look at integrations, that's not expected. That is sometimes the integrations are great, but that's also where you can get into, you may lose potential users because it's so difficult. One, they need that integration. They don't want another tool. But again, they're non-techies that expect a one button click. And I know it's not always possible, but that's the expectation. So, again, another product I worked on was it was a document management system. They needed to integrate with other systems within their organization. What we found was even putting up a couple of fields for configuration to a non-technical user, like, okay, we're going to hook you up. It seems so simple, again, based on technical people working on things. So they understood all these kind of technical terminology to get things hooked up. But the end users, they don't. They want, again, put it behind the scenes. Give me a click. Make me give you very information to make that integration. So I like the topic of integrations because they're important to support those workflows and to make life easier, especially for non-technical users. But I like the topic in this context because even that needs to be magic for a lot of the user base, meaning minimal effort to set that up. So the things you can do in the back end, get basic information everyone understands. Hey, email, password, point to where we need to integrate some of the basic information, and then have a click of a button. And all the checking can go on in the background and without the user really having to do much to think about. Or even better, sorry, I'm getting excited now, is when you kind of know and I'm going to not jump into our smart topic, but systems are getting pretty smart to be able to detect what people are using. For instance, I have a 3D printer. And I'm now able to throw in certain spools of filament, and the system just reads what it is. It knows the temp to set. It knows it knows all of that. It has all of that information. So for me, I can create, and I'm tempted to pull one up now, the most amazing 3D prints, and I'm not technical. And that's kind of new in that world.
Right.
I've already given up if I had to know just all the x-axis, y-axis, and I know
Yes.
the experts need and want that power.
Mm-hmm.
People like me and probably tens of millions of us, just give it to me smart. Make me give you the basic information and take care of the rest. So
this is somewhat related, but recently when I'm setting up these live sessions, what I found, and I think I shared this with you before, I create the session in a tool, and then there's an integration with LinkedIn, and then it allows me to, when I create the session, it then pushes the session details and the registration information into LinkedIn.
Yes.
And LinkedIn creates an event. And so I recently had to contact their support team within LinkedIn because you expect that to happen seamlessly. And once I push that button to say create, that it's done. And on the LinkedIn side, it's ready to go in my feed of posts. Well, what I discovered several times was when that event was being created, the time zone on the event created on the LinkedIn side didn't match the time zone on the event created in this tool. And so what was happening was that the notification was going out to my connections at the wrong time, but it also would not allow me, after a certain point, it would not allow me to correct that time. And so that meant that not only were people notified at the wrong time, but then that also meant that the recording from this session was not available in LinkedIn. So even though that integration, and so my expectation with that integration is that I don't have to turn any other knobs, that it is now done. But what's happened is I've had to go in, I have to remember to go in and manually reset the time zone. And so supports resolution. So again, as a user, my expectation is your system can detect either time zone that my computer's on or the event that was created. You can read the data for that in order to schedule the LinkedIn event at the right time. And so when I spoke to the person in support, he asked me to try an incognito browser. What browser are you on? Do you have a VPN? Turn off your VPN and see what happens. Well, this is not happening with other tools that I'm using. And so for me as the user, what you do on the back end to make it work, but I expect that it should
just
work without me having to be confused. And it doesn't happen all the time, the weird part. So when you think about the expectation that I have, I don't know how it gets done, but I expect that it can be done. That is the way we have to approach the work that we do. Is people expect that it can be done. They don't need to always know how, but you shouldn't have to jump through hoops of incognito browsers, turn off your VPN just to schedule, remember to turn it back. That's too much. That's way too much. Way too much. And it's frustrating because now when I create the event every week, I get a little anxious and make sure that, okay, do I need to write a checklist to make sure that I don't forget to go in and check and make sure it's in the right time zone? So I get a little bit anxious about it because I'm like, am I going to remember all of the steps? Which should be a fairly simple task.
Yes, it should be. and that led to frustration significantly.
Correct. And then I'm telling the support person, well, can you read this data from the event that I created? Can you see this on the back end? And then I'm thinking to myself, wait a second, this person works in their troubleshooting customer service department. They should have the answers to this. I, as the non-technical user, should not be the one to have to prescribe how they solve that problem on the technology side.
Yes.
So that's the interesting challenge. So let me pause for a minute and ask if we have anyone that's joined us. You can throw out your name, where you're from. If you have any comments or questions for us, we have another topic area to get to.
Yeah.
But we'd love to hear from you. All right. So our final area in terms of that value that we can deliver based on the way technology and AI have changed is around what AI is doing to people's expectations. And we're not just talking about generative AI. We're not just talking about AI that can help detect what you're trying to search for, that sort of thing. Well, within a browser or that sort of thing. I should caveat that. This is more about the fact that AI has introduced us to the opportunity to use natural language to find or to gain information. And so when we talk about natural language, that means that I want to be able to use conversational communication to get back information, and that I don't want to have to turn a lot of query, Boolean terms and query terms and that sort of thing. I want to give you a statement and you give me something back.
Yes. And this is one I think all UXers, all people in all kinds of product development.
Mm-hmm.
Since we're UXers, I'll talk about the UXers. Have your eye on this. This is coming up. I have actually been amazed at how much this is coming up when I talk to non-technical users that are now adopting or being kind of pushed on them to adopt in their organizations really complex systems. So, I mean, there's a lot of complex functionality, but because of this, AI's been around, okay? It's machine learning's been around a while, but it's really at the forefront of everyone's mind right now. So, I'll give this example because I like it, and I was fascinated by the fact I had, 10 interviews. They were split. I didn't realize who would be technical or not technical, even though we tried to, split it pretty evenly. But it was amazing to discover how non-technical some of the users of this highly complex system was. And how many of the non-techies were actually saying their answer to me when we were discussing challenges, pain points, magic wands, what could we do? How many times AI came up? They were like, I don't want to build these just these processes they were having, automation. I don't want to have to build these. We keep having to engage with support or services to build them, and then I have to go in and mess with them. It's like, why can't I just type the process I want or say it? And and by the way, this goes into data some organizations already have because they've been in whatever line of business for decades. It's like, why can't I just say, I want this process and this flow, and you build out at least a first iteration for me. So it's kind of like template, but they're going farther than the template. But that's essentially what they want, but they want to do it via the voice command using that AI to go and based on their simple natural language inputs, come back with some initial process that may include documents, it may include, other people as part of it, but in a natural way, and then let them deal with it. So I'm hearing that very frequently, and that's where I think it's really good in interviews. I kind of like that. What in the best of worlds would you like to see happen? What would make you more?
Yes.
What would make you use the product more? And then certainly, when you're doing your wireframing or your task analysis, workflow, I think we should think about that even before talking to the users, because now just assume there's a level of expectation for that.
There's an expectation, absolutely.
GPT and sometimes get documents pulled together for them or recommended processes. So they certainly expect a expert company in the area can kind of give them the same thing within their product.
Yeah. So if I could summarize all that, because there's a
Yeah.
lot of nuggets in that. Workflow tools, report generators, visualization generators, where you have data inside of your organization that allows users to create reports, visualizations, or workflow, things that require configuration. We have to move to allowing people to use words in a natural language format, which means conversational, to speak to what they want. So I want to see this data point across this data point over this timeline, for example, and to allow that to be the way in which they input their query to get back the results. And when we think about that, even in some cases, people are tolerant of getting something back that requires some level of
Yeah.
adjustment or correction. But giving them that starting point accelerates their process or workflow. And it's also for them a more sticky
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
It requires less ramp up. And a lot of you organizations out there have data within your organization that you're either trying to monetize or serve up more effectively for your user or customer. This is the way to approach that scenario. You don't want to just focus on making sure that people can access the data. You want to make sure that they can access it in a way that aligns more closely to their expectations.
Yes.
I love to hear that, because I do believe this is where technology is moving, expectations from customers are
Expectation.
moving, but most importantly, the people who define and design these solutions and build, this is where organizationally, the way in which we look at what a solution or how we define solutions is going to change.
I
You
and
heard it first.
I heard
Well,
it.
we might not be the first, obviously, but that's our stance.
Absolutely. And, even in recent workflows, breaking down where you're getting everyone on the same page, you've done your research, so you're breaking things down, you get it, you've got your ginormous room, every whiteboard filled up on the complicated products because there are so many roles and so many tools and so many tasks and all of that good stuff. It's like now's a good time. One of those stickies should be the let's brainstorm on where AI, based on either partnering with someone,
Mm-hmm.
or explore partnering or how it might be accomplished, or the data you
Mm-hmm.
have goes up on that board. Like up consideration right here.
Mm-hmm.
How can we start pulling that in so we get rid of task 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on our existing, platform, because we got rid of
Mm-hmm.
all those settings and we are going to handle that now. You have so much information, not about not only your data, but a lot of times your users.
Mm-hmm.
You you have a lot of information. If I'm building a template and I
Mm-hmm.
log in, I'm building a template, let's say a form or a process template.
Mm-hmm.
And when I start doing something, because I've been in the system, or a lot of people, other data you have, usually when they add this kind of field or value or condition, it usually means X, whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
It means that next step in that process, 9 times out of 10, has been this in our system. Why aren't you helping the user get there
Yeah.
versus putting
Yeah.
in?
Have that
So,
available.
yeah,
Yeah, make that available, because
yeah,
it's going to be, there's a typical kind of 80% rule around the next step. Why not make that available to people? And as you say all of that, going back to the workflow and pulling out where and when to incorporate these different technologies and this innovation, essentially, what I think of is the fact that there's a lot of data, big data, in-house data. What
mhm,
I think a lot of, or what I know a lot of organizations are struggling with, is that key term of expectations. Knowing your customer's expectation is what drives your ability to innovate and understand how to solve.
yes,
And sometimes, many times, it takes someone who's outside of your organization with an objective lens, who is not emotionally tied or wed to the ideas that have come out of that organization, that is able to gather those expectations from your customer to then allow you to define those assumptions up front that drive where you use natural language, or you use queries that allow people to just use sort of natural language to get what they're looking for. Or when you think about those integrations, you've got to have some expectation around integrate with what and at what point, and what information are you supposed to be delivering in that integration. And when we talk about individuals' expectations and how your tools support them, you've got to have assumptions around where your product fits, which means you have to understand that workflow. So in all cases, customer expectations are where you start any of the effort around delivering value.
Yes. Yep.
It ultimately starts with that.
Yes, it does. It really does. And if you don't do it, someone else probably will.
Absolutely.
That's what I like to stress to people. I mean, right now it could be, maybe, I mean, they're already moving in that direction of competitive advantage, but eventually people, you got to start thinking about it, because it's definitely the direction. And we have really gotten where we want a one button push, or we want to speak to something. I can do a whole lot of even complicated stuff going on Chat GPT. I hate, I hate that, but, they mention it. Even I, talk to a lawyer and they're like, or a paralegal I spoke to was like, I got on there and had it draft. And then
correct. Correct. But that's the way of the future. Yes. And with what you were just saying, this is where larger organizations struggle, because you're focused on so much. And startups have an advantage if they really understand those customer expectations. They have the opportunity to be more scrappy, make quicker decisions, have less debt to manage. So they are ahead of the curve in terms of, if you don't do it, they will, because you're so focused on all of this stuff that in a lot of cases, I put a post out a few weeks ago that said 80%, Pendo put out research that said 80% of the functionality that companies are building into products is not utilized.
Yep.
So as you get bigger, as you get more sophisticated and complicated, that's more debt, that's more baggage for you to manage, versus these smaller, more organizations that have more agility.
Yeah. Yep. They're leaner.
So
agility. Yep.
Yeah. So I put out anybody that has a question. If anyone's joined us, please throw out your questions. So we're going to kind of recap what we've talked about today. So the first is around the influence of AI and how it's going to impact those customer impressions. So we have a question before we get to the next two. Hi there, Ryan. So how do you determine what percentage of customers, or what type of customers, to get expectations and feedback from? That's a really good question. Deanne, you want to get this one? I also have a perspective on it.
Okay. Yeah, well, I would say, but I think percentage of customers is a more difficult, for me, a number. I can't put a number in terms of percentage. And definitely, I think it varies in terms of how many, and how I want to split, how many of the tech advanced users, how many of the non-tech. That I would say that almost 100% depends on the product, and complexity of that project. So, but what I do try to do is work with the marketing teams, understand who they're targeting, look at the existing customer base, like, what's that makeup right now as far as we can glean. And then I just make sure, if I have, let's say I'm doing 10 IDIs, then I will try to split that for a lot of products with 5 and 5, or 3
Mhm.
and 7. It really varies depending on the type of project. But I find it hard to put a percentage because a lot of times I can't even get
So,
access to really how many customers. Go ahead.
yeah, so I think for me it more boils down to being able to understand segments. So if there's the technical versus the non-technical, and then you might then break those down even further to say technical in this role and technical in that role, non-technical in this role and non-technical in that role. So when you break them down, the opportunity, depending on the time and the budget, is to find somewhere around that 5 to 7 for each of those groups. And so if you have the opportunity to define that you're going to get about 5 to 7 in each of those different subsegments, I think that's a good place to start. But what you will find is as you do that work, you don't have to engage all of those. That it becomes a large number that you don't have to engage because you start to see the trends.
You start seeing
So you start out with that plan, but then you get to the point where you see the trends and say to yourself, you know what? We see enough consistency in the trends that we realize these are the heavy hitters, the big rocks, that sort of thing to consider.
And one last thing is if you really want to get a broad initial like sweep of impressions or expectations, that sort of thing, you can blast out to thousands, tens of thousands of customers, a survey. I'm careful with that. I don't rely totally on that survey because you're not going to get the details. Everyone wants everything in the survey, or they're very limited in what they tell you. But that is one where as long as you collect that kind of segment data as part of the survey, you can also start looking at reaching out to touch all of those different roles and see if there's a difference in what they're reporting.
Yes, and it essentially means you go from quantitative survey to qualitative interviews, and you start with that survey to cast the wide net, and then from there you're able to pull out and have a more engaging conversation with a smaller number of people. So that's a really good point. In terms of that second question around the low-hanging fruit to get the first pass, I always see a heuristic evaluation from an outside party like ourselves as the opportunity to evaluate your product, your people, and your process to find that low-hanging fruit. And I recently performed this task with a team and recognized areas that are quick wins in terms of making slight adjustments, using tools where they're not being used today, omitting some aspects of what you're doing based on a simple evaluation, and then follow up with those interviews that Deanne has mentioned.
Yeah, I love the heuristic for the quick when you haven't commenced, executive leadership, maybe that you really need to invest in this. Heuristics are a way to get expertise in there in a really quick fashion. And like Kenya said, it will certainly hit the low hanging fruit, but it might also underscore, hey, you got some bigger problems right here. You need to take the next step. But you can certainly, the heuristics are a great way of uncovering some of those issues.
Yes, and objective heuristics from someone that's outside of your organization that's got a context that's different than people that are actually immersed in that organization. Thank you for those really thoughtful questions. Just to recap in the last few minutes, the first thing in terms of takeaways is customers don't know what's technically feasible, but they have expectations that tech will do things that they cannot always articulate, but they know that they're possible or hope that and expect that they're possible. Deanne, did you want to add anything to that?
That's good.
Next one up.
Integration.
Oops. Okay, here I go. There we go. Oh, sorry. Okay, now I got it right. There we go.
Integrations with apps and systems already in use. And that plays hand in hand with expectations of seamless interactions and easy. Don't make me think about it.
That's right.
In my opinion.
And you need to understand what they're actually using to know what to integrate with.
Yeah.
Just because you know that they're, broadly speaking, using these different applications doesn't mean that you can just pick one and decide to integrate. All right. And finally,
oh, me again.
it's
Will
funny.
influence customers' expectations of how they access and interact with your company's data. And I wish we could put star, 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 star on that one. Given the shift I've seen, not only just in technology, media, and news, but firsthand. Almost every engagement I'm in, non-technical users are very aware of where AI, what AI can
Mm-hmm.
do for them, even if they don't know, all those details. Yep.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for listening
Yep.
in today. And we will see you next week at 12 Eastern. Have a great week.
Bye.
Bye.